Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hello, I'm your host, Chris Lamont, alongside Medlir. In this episode, we ask the question, what does the election of Donald Trump mean for the future of AI governance? Of course, there are many think pieces, analyses, and commentaries that have been penned since the election that seek to offer some insight into how a second Trump administration might approach artificial intelligence. One question many are asking is, will Trump attempt to undo the Biden administration's efforts to introduce AI governance frameworks, or will Trump take a more cautionary approach, emphasizing concerns over the risk posed by AI, and quietly build upon the groundwork laid by the previous administration and also his own administration, which had been the first to set out executive-level guidance on artificial intelligence in the United States? If we reflect on President Biden's AI governance legacy, the Biden administration largely focused on concerns regarding the risks posed by AI for democracy, consumers, AI biases, and potential discriminatory harm, which were concerns largely shared by Europeans. Over the last 4 years, we have also seen movement on content mediation algorithms and transatlantic efforts to counter AI-enabled disinformation campaigns. And of course, in October 2023, the Biden administration set out an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, which highlighted 8 principles to guide policy across U.S. executive agencies. But the Republican Party has promised to repeal the Biden administration's executive order and will likely attempt to stake out its own ground upon which to formulate the new administration's AI policy that puts an emphasis on innovation over risk. But it would be a mistake to assume this means the end of the story. Indeed, Elon Musk, who Trump seeks to bring into his administration through a new presidential advisory commission, has been a supporter of recent initiatives to regulate AI at the state level, such as California's recent attempt to adopt a state-level AI regulatory framework. Medlir, the question of AI specifically did not figure prominently in the U.S. presidential campaign, but key figures around Donald Trump appear conflicted as to how to approach AI. Some, including Elon Musk, denounced algorithmic guardrails and content mediation on social media as reflecting and amplifying values not in sync with the Republican Party's priorities, while others narrowly approach AI through the lens of U.S.-China security competition, and some in the past, including Musk again, have cautioned against existential risk posed by AI. How do you see these contradictions being untangled once the new administration takes office?
Well, I think, Chris, contradictions is the right way to approach this. I think as all things Trump, when it comes to policy, it's unpredictable in some ways, but also somewhat contradictory. Part of this because he seems to just thrive in this kind of chaos, right, where people are coming from different angles. Loyalty is the main kind of frame of reference, the main litmus test, but he does have people that come from different backgrounds, and they've all coalesced around him. We can call them all disruptors or whatever. So this is a rather disruptive administration, at least it looks like it when we look at the new cabinet nominations. But when it comes to artificial intelligence and kind of the future of AI governance, so to speak, in the U.S. context, but then implications globally, I would argue that there are perhaps 3 or 4 big kind of items, takeaways that I think we can assert with some certainty. One of them is, as you hinted, that the new administration is going to step away and step back from the Biden White House regulatory approach. Remember that under the Biden White House, as you pointed with the executive order, Biden preferred a multi-agency approach to the governance of AI. This includes the Department of Commerce, the Office of Management and Budget, and other agencies and other individuals involved. And there was a fear even then, and when Biden administration kind of unveiled this approach, that this would be perhaps too massive, and this would create a centralized and massive database that would be highly valuable to geopolitical adversaries, and then could become a target to cyber warfare and espionage. So I suspect that one of the first things we'll see is stepping back from this kind of massive regulatory kind of establishment that the Biden White House had instituted. And I want to be careful here because I agree with some statements that others have made that there isn't much regulations, by the way, to deregulate here. And what I mean by that is that even the executive order and all of these things that we talked about, these are not the equivalent of the EU AI Act. These are still, for the most part, voluntary agreements on the part of big tech companies, as well as even the White House, and saying, here are some guardrails when it comes to the implementation of AI. But even these, I suspect, are going to be taken away from the Trump administration when we see a new administration. The second thing that I think we'll see would be a continuation of the Biden administration's emphasis on AI innovation. And here, so there's some disruption on the regulatory framework, but on the innovation one, and I think the rest of these issues, we're going to see more continuity rather than less continuity. So,
and interestingly, the previous Trump administration as well, right?
That's correct. Let's not forget that Trump comes into the White House with plenty of experience. He has also a bit clearer agenda than he had in the past. And of course, fewer checks on power. But don't forget that the Trump administration held a summit on the role of AI in industry. In September of 2018, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency announced that it committed $2 billion to AI research funding. Back in 2019, so before, towards the twilight of his first term, the Trump administration also designed a regulatory framework based on like research development, infrastructure, governance, workforce, international engagement. So it's not like we don't know what they aimed at doing, but I think the major difference here is going to be on the issue of the regulation. I think the other big difference between, I think, Trump, and we'll talk more about this when it comes to U.S. and China, but between Trump and the Biden administration is how we approach China and how we approach our allies. Because the CHIPS Act and other kinds of actions the United States has taken have emphasized both, in a way, starving China of access to high-tech kind of technology on the part of the United States, as well as subsidizing a lot of research, innovation, education, and even companies like the Taiwanese companies coming to the United States. It seems that Trump may continue with the export controls kind of measures to stall China's economic progress. However, it's likely to pull back on the subsidies with regards to the various, like I said, tech companies, or even in the field of education and infrastructure. On the latter, to be honest with you, I know there's people that argue that he may no longer subsidize a certain even research. I think that may continue rather than actually stop.
Right, and not just a continuation of export controls, but potentially a broadening of some of these controls to include.
I'd argue and growing that he's always signaled that on his first day in office he's going to increase by 100% tariffs, not on the AI issue, but just across the board. Trump clearly sees tariffs and sees export controls as a way, not just as an end in itself, as a means to an end, both to impose U.S. policy choices and preferences, and in the case of AI, also to kneecap China's economic growth at a very delicate moment for China.
And to be more specific, if we are to better understand some of the differences between Biden and Trump's approach to AI, we could take as an example Biden's executive order's focus on bias risks as perhaps being one example of an issue of concern that won't be a priority under the new administration.
Yeah, I think anything that looks like, look, we had this conversation off air as well. One of the concerns of let's say, the future Trump administration and those around him is that AI and a lot of these regulations also been used to govern or to censor free speech. And so I think that we're going to see, if we're going to see any dismantling of any of this, it's going to be especially foremost on the issue of censorship, issues of what they argue, like the governance of misinformation and disinformation, and the impact on that. Of course, this comes at a very inopportune time for the United States because Russia, I think, has spent about $2 billion on overseas influence campaigns, China about $7 billion, whereas the State Department has, by the way, even now under the Biden administration, has an annual budget of combating disinformation campaigns. The budget comes to $61 million. All right, so it's a completely asymmetric kind of power there between what the Americans are investing and where our adversaries are pulling in. But it's clear that Trump is going to approach this area with a lot of skepticism, especially when you have people like, again, Musk and RFK Jr. and others that basically are going to argue that much of government power has been used to stifle and censor free speech. And so anything they've seen in the AI regulatory framework that does that is going to be removed.
So I guess here you're talking about content mediation.
Correct. So, Chris, since we are on this topic of Elon Musk and people around him and this question of content regulation and mediation, Reuters actually recently reported that Donald Trump is considering appointing a czar and that Elon Musk will not fill that position. It seems that maybe even for Elon Musk, there's a limit to how many things he can do at the same time. But who in the tech world do you think, and from everything you have seen, could actually that Trump could draw upon for his shortlist for this role? And how important do you think this role will be in setting the tone for AI policy within the administration?
Well, let's emphasize for our listeners, we're talking about a role that is reported to be likely, but not yet confirmed. And also, we're talking about the mandate and potential impact of that not yet confirmed role. But if we do try to answer this question, there have been interviews that the transition team has been conducting and vetting of potential candidates for an earlier czar role that was reported, and that would be a crypto czar. And there's some speculation that this team, which is vetting kind of crypto people from the universe of crypto executives for this role, could be combined, right? Or it might still be separate, right? So there's not really a consensus on what this position will be. But I think kind of who gets tapped for a role like this will send a strong symbolic signal about some of those contradictions that we mentioned in the introduction, about like how those will be settled by the new administration. But I could say that if such a role is established, one of the things that's been reported is that the AI czar would be responsible for keeping America's AI edge over competitors, right? So if we think about, as you mentioned earlier, one of the priorities of the new administration, but also of the previous administration, right, was to maintain the US's technological edge, right? AI. I think I remember the very first episode of this podcast, we talked about the US's AI national security strategy. One thing that's interesting here is that there's been some speculation that if this role is created, the US AI czar would work closely with chief AI officers appointed by federal agencies. Now, interestingly, this chief AI officer role was a role created by the Biden administration, right? So we talk about, although there have been suggestions, right? And of course, Trump perhaps would like symbolically to throw out the kind of previous administration's approach to AI regulation, that there are going to be perhaps some facets of that will be preserved under the new administration. And of course here, this is something that we can talk about in a little bit more detail. We're talking about the approach to governance of AI, but we haven't really talked about the US's strategy of governing with AI, right? And here, this role would supposedly work very closely with the kind of I guess it's named the Department of Government and Efficiency, but it's a planned U.S. Presidential Advisory Commission, just to make that clear for listeners, which would supposedly harness artificial intelligence to assist in carrying out its mission in aim to detect government waste and reduce government waste. And also, there might be more controversial applications for AI in different spheres of governance and among different executive agencies.
Yeah, I mean, this is important, by the way. Just two things on what you just said. One of them, the kind of the carryovers, the people from the Biden administration staying around for the Trump administration.
Or roles, at least, right?
Yeah, the roles, at least. So I've spoken to people currently they're working at least in and around that space of the AI office in the White House. And what they have said, at least to me, is that they're trying as much as they can to institutionalize, right, some of these regulations and some of these roles, perhaps. And we both know that institutions are sticky in the short to medium term. And so the idea and the hope is that perhaps this can resist, perhaps, this new kind of drive for efficiency. I'm not as hopeful, partly because, again, you do have Musk and Ramaswamy that is actually going, I think it's going to be easy picking, right? Some of these early institutions that haven't been properly institutionalized, that you can actually sweep them away. On the other thing that you were just pointing out is that, governing with AI, I mentioned already the fact that there is this issue of misinformation and disinformation. There is talk that they may use AI, as you pointed out, to apply it in an effort to cut down on costs of running government agencies, to identify efficiencies and inefficiencies. But even in the kind of like the main issue that we identify with Trump, which is about immigration, there is a discussion about Homeland Security using AI in a way to address Trump's number one demand, which is going to be mass deportations. And the fact of the matter is that actually Homeland Security already employs an AI system. It's called a Repository for Analytics in a Visualized Environment, or Raven. And it's a huge government contract they use for this. The government already has access to biometric data. They already monitor many of the undocumented migrants. And they also use predictive analytics to actually know which of the migrants. Now, I'm not in a position to say how effective it's been given the immigration and the massive challenge of immigration in the United States. But the fact is that these instruments are already in place, and some argue that this could be actually perhaps one use of AI for governance within the United States government.
We recently talked with, of course, Maritza Schake, who described after the election as being a kind of an illustration of the tech coup argument that was made in a recently published book. But at the same time, there have been criticisms of big tech by some of Trump's kind of more high-profile nominees for key roles, such as Brendan Carr over at the FCC. While the earlier question suggests when it comes to AI, we could see a shift in regulatory approach away from risk and guardrails, when it comes to the U.S. transatlantic relationship, of course, the EU has put in place a much more robust regulatory framework. For example, if we think about the EU's Digital Markets Act in 2022, it subjects U.S. big tech firms such as Apple, Google, and Meta to European antitrust rules. And in the past, the Biden administration, for the most part, did not really challenge these developments. But the incoming Trump administration has signaled to Silicon Valley that it sees the EU regulatory approaches to big tech as disproportionately harming the U.S. and is thus much more likely to push back aggressively against EU efforts to become a global rule setter for AI and emerging tech. How vulnerable do you see the AI sector in particular being to the broader turbulence that might be forthcoming in EU-US trade relations?
Well, let me start from the top. You're talking about the tech coup and the tech bros. I think there's an area that is completely unpredictable, is the impact that the tech bros will have in and around the Trump administration. Partly because you do have such a disparate group of people, right? So you have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but then you have venture capitalists like Mark Anderson and Ben Horowitz, who have actually been donating to America PAC, and they want less regulation. But as you pointed out, Musk himself was one of those who signed on to a possible moratorium, right? A 6-month moratorium, even more, to halt work until we understand what's going on. And there's no better illustration of this. And there's two quotes that I actually just pulled out as I was thinking about this. One is, you remember the Future of Life Institute co-founder, Max Tegmark. He told The Guardian, actually, just not too long ago, that Elon Musk's influence on the incoming Trump administration could mean that he'll persuade Trump to understand that an AGI race is a suicide race. So he's projecting onto this the hope that Musk will have this impact. But then you have Mark Anderson on the other side, who basically, once Trump wins the election, says on AI regulation, says, stick a fork in it, it's over. And he says the U.S. will be the preeminent AI superpower in the world after all, thinking and arguing that deregulation is the way you go there. So we have both we have a projection of what people want to see in this new Trump administration. We don't know yet which way he is going to go. And I suspect that you're probably going to see kind of instinctively moving both ways, right? Because so much of it is about gut politics and about politics of the moment rather than just a long-term policy in this direction. So it'll be interesting of who Trump favors at a particular moment, and I think that argument may carry water at that particular moment. Now, with regards to the EU, I think this is interesting. First of all, I would contest the argument that, or rather, let me put it this way. I think that at this moment, the Europeans themselves are probably fed up with their role as a rule setter in the world. And we've commented on this already. The French are ready to toss caution to the wind. They're calling the next AI Safety Summit, they're calling the AI Action Summit, meaning that they are less concerned with regulation, with guidelines and frameworks, and more concerned with innovation. So I would argue that perhaps on that front, perhaps Europe will be more of a competitor to the United States when it comes to innovation, and be more of a threat than it used to be when you wanted to just set norms. Okay, so that's one important part. There's another part here that brings into play, I think, the U.S. Congress as well. First of all, when it comes to U.S.-EU or U.S.-allied relations, there's a question on whether the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, this is the main transatlantic forum for policy coordination on trade, economic, and technology issues, will survive. For the time being, this has been the main forum for the United States and Europeans to have these conversations. But that conversation doesn't necessarily have to take place just between, let's say, executive branches or between EU, Commission, and the White House. There's a role there for the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament that they can play here. So there is some space here. And this is what, by the way, an area that hasn't been discussed a whole lot. But there's a space here for the legislative to play some role. And I think while we're on this, it's important to point out that over the last year, now we don't have a lot of end product here, but there's a lot of process. There's over 120 bills that the U.S. Congress is reviewing currently that aim at regulating AI that are floating around the U.S. Congress. There's some of that legislation has already advanced the U.S. House of Representatives. Specifically, the U.S. House Science, Space, and Technology Committee has approved 9 bipartisan bills. And these bills would actually, it's not just in the matter of regulation, right, and regulating AI, but it's about innovation and it's about research and education. So,
about AI governance more broadly,
correct.
AI innovation.
Exactly. So they're earmarking about $2.6 billion over the next 6 years for the National AI Research Resource to establish pilot programs set up by the National Science Foundation. And so there is that element of this. And this was recently September 2024. These 9 bills have come out of committee. Now, of course, the question is whether the remainder of this Congress will be able to pass that, or more likely than not, they're probably going to have to try again with the new Congress starting in January 2025. But I'd point out to this that the White House is, and the executive branch is not the only main actor here. Congress, legislative can play a role. And of course, states can play a role too. And we can talk more about that. But this is, at least for now, I think an important part to stop.
Well, I think if you think about the movement in Congress towards this proliferation of AI-related legislation, one thing that we haven't really talked about specifically that is in the shadows is U.S.-China geopolitical competition and how AI figures into that, which is perhaps a bigger question than the question that was asked earlier about U.S. transatlantic relations going forward under the Trump administration. How do you see U.S.-China competition shaping the Trump administration's approach to artificial intelligence?
Well, I think here we'll see a lot of continuity with the Biden administration. And of course, as you pointed out earlier, there will be maybe a doubling down on this export control measures, right? And so my premise, I'd love to hear kind of like your pushback on it or maybe amplify some of the things I'm saying. But first of all, it's clear that Trump has already identified China, and this is consistent going back to his first administration, in the interregnum, and then now. China is considered by Trump at least the primary threat in the AI race. He mentioned this also in one of the recent, I think, podcast interviews that he did. It wasn't Rogan, but it was, I think, Logan Paul, I think. It wasn't on his, I can't believe we're saying this in this podcast. But anyways, so that's in his podcast.
Those are the podcasts he goes on, I guess.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I was resisting, but I have to say it. I mean, even during his administration, he sought to limit the reach of Chinese technology firms, such as Huawei, right, in the United States. There's a continuation here. The Biden administration has further expanded those restrictions, seeking to suppress Beijing's access to semiconductors and critical technologies. We've talked about this. And this identification of China as the main AI threat, it has bipartisan support, right? And actually, you have a bipartisan congressional commission called the Manhattan Project. Or rather, they are urging for a Manhattan Project for AI to outpace China, going back to, obviously, to the original Manhattan Project with regards to nuclear weapons. And so the commission itself, again, bipartisan, is recommending contracts for AI, cloud, and data center firms to ensure U.S. leadership. Also suggests giving the executive branch the power to award multi-year contracts and funding for AI, cloud, and data center firms. And so the idea is that this would establish the U.S. AGI leadership. You mentioned here the very first episode of this podcast back in 2022. Is that how long it's been? Or was it 21? 21. We've been at this for a little bit. And so more than 3 years ago was about the U.S. national security approaches to AI. And a lot of the Manhattan Project seems to be like a continuation of those conversations.
From that presidential commission report that we discussed.
Correct. That's correct. And so there is also another element here, by the way, one last thing. And like I said, I'd love to hear your take on this. But it seems that Trump wants to eliminate any kind of subsidies. And among those, he's also threatening on this U.S.-China thing. He's threatening to actually put tariffs and export controls on Taiwanese exports to the United States. Because in his words, Taiwan is taking all the good things away from us and they're not giving us enough good things back. And so it gets really complicated, right? When we talk about U.S.-China relations,
Well, I think this is just to give you a concrete example. I mean, this is going to be, if you think about export controls and chips and trying to starve the Chinese tech sector of sources of kind of innovation at that kind of top tier, this creates dilemmas and problems for U.S. allies, and particularly if you think about countries like Japan, right, where you have a large export market in China, but also if you think about kind of ASML, the Netherlands, Europe, right, China is a big market there, that all of these will require some sort of negotiation with U.S. allies that are also part of these complex technology supply chains. These are things that the Trump administration won't be able to do necessarily on its own. And also, if you take China seriously as a geostrategic competitor and you take artificial intelligence seriously as a key part of that geopolitical race, then you do need guardrails, right? If we look at, for example, recent reports of the Chinese armed forces using Meta's Llama model and Meta's response that, well, we have a user agreement that prohibits users from using this for military purposes, right? But largely is unenforceable. These types of tools, and the question of kind of whether or not AI models can be open source for purposes of transparency, all of these things that we've been talking about in previous episodes intersect and will require some sort of executive level consensus or intervention. So kind of the freewheeling kind of innovation, everything, everybody has access to everything ethos, right? That is kind of like the myth that is.
Yeah, but I suspect that if you ask the Trump administration, they'll push back and say, look, we are all about deregulating the national space. But when it comes to international systems or international relations, we probably do need some kind of regulatory frameworks, especially in the space of the lethal autonomous weapon systems or others. Again, it's a question of what that means for the United States, but I can imagine that the current agreement, for example, to step away that Xi Jinping and Biden just signed when it came to the non-use, right, of AI in certain specific nuclear contexts, probably be carried over, right? And so there are some space, I think, with regulation at the global level, and some of these agreements will take place, but domestically, I don't see that being the case.
Right, but how do you, if it's open source, it's out there. You can't build a border
of course.
around it, right? Like, which means there's going to have to be some sort of domestic regulation also, right?
Yes, and maybe on this, the last bit that perhaps goes unmentioned in some of this is you mentioned the domestic regulatory framework here or space. There's very little discussion about the impact of states. Of course, the United States is a federal system, and so you have the things that the federal government does, but also states can take initiatives as well to regulate their particular space. And so there's at least three states in the United States that have already taken some measures. So California, of course, is among those. I think just this year, Governor Newsom signed, 20 AI bills into law. Of course, the most famous one. But even that one almost signaled Newsom's lack of desire to really have a fight at his hands with AI and tech companies. And now it turns out with the Trump administration over big regulations. And it seems that he's unlikely to take up any fights. But there's enough in those 20 AI bills to argue that California has started that path towards regulation. I would argue the most aggressive one of all those is the Colorado AI Act. It looks a lot like the EU AI Act. Actually, it's a risk-based assessment, and there are some penalties associated. I think it's $20,000 per violation. So it'll be interesting to see what that means. But this was back in May of 2024. It's the first actually comprehensive artificial intelligence legislation in the United States at the state level. But here's the catch. It goes into effect in February of 2026. So we've got about a year and a half. And the question is, what will happen between now and then? Will the federal government intervene? Will there be federal legislation that will override it? But if it doesn't, the Colorado AI Act foresees imposing mounting obligations on developers and deployers on high-risk AI systems. It asks deployers of AI systems to complete annual impact assessments for high-risk systems, and also requires the deployers and developers providing any consumer-facing AI systems, not just high-risk, but any of those, that they actually specifically point out to the consumer that they are interacting with AI systems, unless the interaction would be obvious to a reasonable person they're dealing with an AI person. So California, Colorado, and Utah has actually the nation's first AI policy. Regulation Innovation Office. And so there are some steps from these. And by the way, in Utah, you have what's called the Silicon Slopes instead of Silicon Valley. And Colorado also is being seen as kind of like a future tech center.
Although politically, they're very different states for your...
Very different, but Utah and Colorado have been working together actually very closely. The Utah governor and the Colorado governor have been collaborating on issues of misinformation, polarization, and tech collaboration. So a very liberal governor in Colorado and a moderate, I'd argue, governor in Utah, and they've been working on these issues together. So there is space there, I think, for states to also be leading this thing. But the question is, will the Trump administration give them, right? And will the Congress actually give them the time to implement those at the state level?
Well, Medlir, it looks like we are out of time for today. There's certainly a lot more that we could have talked about, but that'll have to wait for next time. So join us again for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.